He's a publishing giant who served in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, became active in politics, even ran for president. I voted for him during a primary. One of the originals to propose the simple flat tax. I think it was 16 or 17% at the time. A very common sense approach to normal issues in business, and school vouchers as well, which still have yet to gain traction. He's also an author with impeccable timing. His new book is out titled Inflation, What It Is, Why It's Bad, and How to Fix It. It's a great book. I just finished reading it. Please welcome the chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, Mr. Steve Forbes. Thank you very much for lending your voice to the Voice of Pittsburgh today.
Great to be with you, Kevin. Thank you.
That's our pleasure. Thank you. And your new book is incredible, very informative, a simple education for all. Even I could understand it. So I highly recommend it to anyone with questions. You and your crew really knocked it out of the park on this one.
Well, thank you. We tried to do it in a public-friendly way. No jargon. Get to the point. It's not that complicated. Lay it out, and hopefully policymakers will respond instead of continuing to wreak havoc on the economy.
Yeah, and so let's just stick with the title, inflation. There are two basic forms of inflation. What is inflation, and why does it happen?
You're right. There are two kinds. One is what you might call non-monetary inflation. That can happen with prices going up, say, because of a drought or because of a war such as we're seeing in Ukraine, which is affecting food prices, or the lockdowns that we had with COVID. Now, normally that kind of non-monetary inflation, if the government would allow it, would work itself out over time. After World War II, we went through a period of huge rising prices, trying to make a peacetime economy, convert it from a wartime economy, and within a couple of years, prices settled down and we moved forward. Unfortunately, on the non-monetary policy front, sadly, this administration is continuing to put obstacles in the way. Most notably, its war against fossil fuels, oil and gas, unnecessarily making them more expensive, harder to produce. They're now waging war on railroads. They are trying to put price controls on the internet and hurt investment there. They put in new rules that are going to make infrastructure projects, as the president says he loves, but he's just made it harder to get these things off the ground. You know, there's no reason why you can't do a bridge or a road in 2 years instead of 10 years. So they're putting those obstacles in the way. Now, the other kind of inflation, which is a longer term, even more ominous, is monetary inflation. That is the government undermining, devaluing their currency, in this case, the dollar, making it less valuable, which means the prices you pay go up. And the Federal Reserve was doing this before the COVID crisis. It continued to print a lot of money during the COVID crisis. And now they suddenly realize they have a problem. And unfortunately, Kevin, they're doing, with the way they're approaching it, they could end up putting us in a recession.
It could get even worse than that. Your book points out that over time, over the last 4,000 years since money was, invented, politicians cannot get it right. Is it greed that always makes them devalue the currency?
It's a very good question. They always overspend. They always want to do more things than they have the money for. So they don't like raising taxes. So instead, they reduce the value of the money. And then the other thing is, which we see playing out today, is they always try to blame somebody else. We point out in the book that in Roman times, they blamed the Christians for inflation. In medieval times, they blamed witches. In the early 1920s in Germany, they blamed Jewish bankers and merchants for their terrible inflation, which created the conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler. Then in the 1970s, Richard Nixon blamed Arab oil producers. Today, President Biden's blaming oil producers, food producers, Vladimir Putin, drug companies. Who knows who will point the finger at next?
Do you think that politicians or political types like to blame other people for that and use currency as a weapon to retain power or just to pass the buck?
Yes, it's all about retaining power. They're not going to say, oh, we messed up, because they know what happened to them. So they say, oh, it's that person's fault or that group's fault. Again, we see that happening today. I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration, before the elections, decides to put on price controls. The last time we did that was disastrous back in the 1970s, led to shortages and the like. But desperate politicians do desperate things.
And there's always talk of price controls, and it never seems to work out as planned or as promised. That even in the simple price controls of rental controls, it's a disaster in the end on that. Look at New York City.
Well, that's right, because it hurts new construction. And so in New York, one reason why apartments are so expensive is a developer doesn't dare put housing in for a middle class because you're not going to make any money. So they put in these very expensive apartments. So you have 6 people living together, young people. And so grossly distorts the market. And then the politicians put in public housing, which in New York has been a horror, the way they've run their public housing. So instead of just letting people provide housing for different segments of the market, the politicians in New York have made a huge mess, among other messes they made in New York.
Yeah, it's absolutely a mess. And in terms of the world markets, to water down our currency, to weaken our dollar, which is basically a measure of value or worth, with a weak dollar, it's bad, right? It's going to really affect our country because we are the world's reserve currency.
Well, yes. When you fool around with a currency, it has repercussions all around the world. It affects how people produce in other countries. And if people feel you're cheating, they're going to then play with their money. That's what happened in the 1930s, what they called beggar thy neighbor policies, where everyone was in a race to the bottom, and we never really recovered from the Depression until after World War II. So the consequences are bad, and that's why, again, we wrote the book. So to warn people, here's what is really happening, non-monetary and monetary, and here's how to fix it.
Okay, and we've gotten through the what it is and why it's bad. We're talking about the book Inflation, what it is, why it's bad, and how to fix it. The co-author of it is Steve Forbes. He's the chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media. So how do we fix it?
We fix the non-monetary kind by the government stepping back and removing barriers to production. We should be producing more fossil fuels so the price can come down, not putting on all of these crazy rules that make infrastructure projects extremely difficult to get off the ground. Remove those artificial barriers, the opposite of what they're doing now. On the monetary front, the Federal Reserve should get away from the idea. They think the way you control inflation is by depressing the economy. When they talk about a soft landing, that is Federal Reserve speak for slowing the economy down and hoping it doesn't go into a full-blown recession. And that's what they're trying to do now. So leave the economy alone, stop printing the money, reduce the money supply. They have trillions of dollars that they're sitting on that's ready to flood the economy and make things worse. So bottom line, treat the dollar with respect, which the Fed has not done, and the government stop standing in the way of people who want to get positive things done.
Is it true that the Federal Reserve has flooded our economy in the last 2 years with 35% more cash just printing it? Is that accurate? With nothing backing it?
Yeah, there are various ways of measuring the money supply, and the one that, if you want to impress people, talk about M2. And M2 is the popular one. That's gone up 40% in the last 2 years. And there was one thing to provide money during the lockdowns when everything was shut down and people suddenly found themselves choking. That's one thing. But when that immediate crisis was over, there was no reason why for the Federal Reserve to keep on printing money last year. And then what they would do is they'd print the money. Well, let me quickly explain how they do it. It's quite something. They'll call up a bond dealer like Goldman Sachs or Bank of America or somebody, and say, we want to buy $1 billion of government bonds. The dealer says, fine. They deliver the bonds. And how does the Federal Reserve pay for the bonds? They credit the dealer's account with $1 billion that they created out of thin air. They just say, voila, you have $1 billion. It's the ultimate ATM. Imagine having that at the end of the month when your bills come. You just say, voila, fill up my checking account. That's how they create the money. So they've been creating it, then they borrow it short-term overnight so it doesn't immediately flood the economy. But right now they're sitting on almost $2 trillion of cash, the Federal Reserve, that could come cascading into the economy if they're not careful.
And if that comes
so they
into
really created a mess.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but so when that $2 trillion comes into the economy, prices of everything else will go up because there's nothing backing that money.
That's right. And so what they should do is undo what they did, extinguish that money instead of letting it, it's like a dam. You don't want the dam to break and the water flooding the economy. Drain it.
Yeah. Let's talk about valuation. Say in the year 2000, one of the years you ran for president, say that someone made 50 grand a year back then. What would that 50 grand actually be worth today? What would they have to make to equal that money now?
Very, very good point. They probably have to make about $80,000,
Just
$85,000.
just to equal that 50 grand back then.
And this you raise a very interesting point. Back for most of our history, we had a gold standard for almost 200 years. And in the 1950s and 60s, when we had it after World War II, the U.S. economy grew at a little over 4% a year on average. Some years are better than others, but it averaged 4%. Since we've been playing with the money, like these people have been doing since the 1970s, the average growth rate has gone down to about 2.5%, 2.75%. That doesn't sound like a lot, Kevin, but if you compound that over 50 years, if we had maintained our historic growth rates that this country had been doing for 200 years, we'd maintain those historic growth rates since we went off the gold standard. The median household income, which today is $67,000, would instead be $100,000 to $110,000. Now, wouldn't everyone be happy with $30,000, $40,000 more of income? I think so, but that's the price you pay when the politicians and the central bankers muck around with the value of the dollar.
Wow, that is unbelievable. Sort of made me just sick right there. Thank you. Can our poor monetary policy be responsible for a spike in crime or social unrest or upheaval just because of that?
You hit on something else. Absolutely. Inflation is not just about economy. It's also about trust. If you have trustworthy money, I don't have to know you, you don't have to know me, but we can do complex transactions together because we trust the currency. And when the politicians start devaluing the currency, it's like suddenly you find the hour instead of 60 minutes has 62 minutes. You don't quite understand why. And so it undermines trust between people. And we mentioned earlier the scapegoating that goes on. What is going on? Why is it happening? Why can't I seem to get ahead? Why is there more speculation? Why doesn't honest work seem to get the rewards that it did in the past? It's like acid in the society. And as the book points out, and you mentioned this, is that countries that routinely trash their money have much more violence and crime than those that don't. You see it in Brazil. Now, I know in the last couple of years, Brazil's tried to maintain a stable currency, but most of its history, they're always trashing it, always having inflation. And it's a very violent country.
So they tinker with it just to sort of control and keep power. And what would happen if the Federal Reserve was audited? What would we find? And if they abolished it, who would create our money?
Well, we used to have banks, in effect, create money before the Federal Reserve. And by the way, that gets to cryptocurrencies. These things they call stable coins, not Bitcoin, but stable coins that are tied to a fixed asset. I could see that someday in the next 5 years starting to compete against government money. Not today. The technology's not there yet, but I could see that evolving. But the Federal Reserve, in addition to doing the banking for the government, the Treasury Department deposits its cash at the Federal Reserve. When you send a check into the IRS, it goes into the IRS's checking account at the Federal Reserve. And just to boggle your mind, you know what the bank balance is, the Treasury's bank balance is at the Federal Reserve now, their checking account?
No.
$960 billion they have sitting in their checking account. But anyway, but in addition to that, the Fed should have only two tasks. One is to keep the dollar stable in value. Stop trying to guide the economy and play games like that. And the other thing is when you do get a disaster, like we had in 2008 or the COVID lockdowns, then you do provide emergency funds to make sure everything doesn't fall apart. But those crises should be rare. Rest of the time, the Fed should just have the boring job of keeping the dollar stable in value. And, we have a bureau inside the Commerce Department of weights and measures. Nobody knows it's there because everyone assumes that a gallon of gasoline doesn't change in size each day. the clocks don't change the number of minutes in an hour each day. So the Fed should be a boring institution that nobody has to pay attention to if it's doing its job right.
The federal government seems to spend without consequence. Our national debt is greater than everything that we'll produce this year. The government sells its loans simply to pay its bills. So how does this all end?
It should end, one, by stopping making the disease worse. So that would involve putting a stable value on the dollar, as we used to do. It would involve cutting taxes, not raising taxes, reducing regulations, not piling on regulations. And we've done it before. After World War II, we had debt as high as we did today for a good reason. We were saving civilization, so we took on a lot of debt to do it. But then it's hard to believe now, but after World War II to the 1970s, before we started to play with the dollar, went off the gold standard, the debt to GDP, just with a little bit of the sensible fiscal government policy, went from 120% of GDP down to 35%. So growth will do it. Allow for growth, and these liabilities become less burdensome. It's one thing, let's say you have a $100,000 debt, but you only have a $20,000 income. That $100,000 debt looks a lot better if you have, say, a $300,000 income. So you want to grow the assets of the economy, economic growth. And we've done it before, and I hope we do it again soon.
And speaking of debt, the President Biden talking about canceling student loan debt. What would that do to our economy?
Well, what it does is, again, undermine trust. There are millions of people who paid back the debts that they took on. It also doesn't get to the administration of our colleges and universities these days. There's no reason why the sticker price for going to college rises at 4 times the rate of inflation. And what happens is the government makes it easy to get loans, or they give you grants, and all the universities as a whole do is raise the sticker price. So you have half the kids don't complete college within 6 years, and they're stuck with the debt. The big debt comes with graduate students. So you got to deal with the underlying cause of the problem instead of, and the president, by the way, doesn't have the authority to forgive debt. That's going to go to the courts. You just can't come and say, your credit card debt is gone. No, that's not the way the world works. So they got to deal with the real causes. And by the way, it can be done. Purdue University, fine school, engineering school, great reputation, comes up with some great sports teams from time to time. Mm-hmm. But in the last 10 years in Purdue, they got a new president 10 years ago, a former governor named Mitch Daniels, and they've not raised tuition in 10 years. And they have a fine school. And then they focus on classroom teaching. And 10 years, no tuition increase.
Wow.
Good school.
Stick to the basics then.
Yes.
Chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, Mr. Steve Forbes. The new book is called Inflation, What It Is, Why It's Bad, and How to Fix It. I love the book. I read it in a weekend. I've read a lot of books on monetary policy. I'm not highly educated, but I try to read these books. I read everything from Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, to The Creature from Jekyll Island, to The Tower of Babel and Rothbard, and all of them. I try to read them all, and this book is so easy to understand. You do a phenomenal job on it. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the kind words. And you are you are highly educated. You know more than the Federal Reserve. That's a low bar, I know, but
I truly appreciate that. Oh, I have one question for you, though. An electrician friend of mine was at my house doing some work over the weekend. I told him I was going to be speaking with you. His eyes lit up. He said that he met your father, Malcolm Forbes, years ago when your dad spoke at a fire hall near Bridgeville, Pennsylvania. He and others had motorcycled into the area and did a speaking tour.
Right.
Were you there?
No, I wasn't, but my father loved motorcycles, and as he got older, he became more addicted to them. He got to the point where he started to commute from his home in New Jersey, 40 miles from New York. He started to commute on a motorcycle, and then he started riding the motorcycles in New York City with all the potholes, and you had sort of generational role reversal, the kids telling the father, be careful. These things can be dangerous. You can get hurt.
And he did that. He did motorcycles and the hot air balloons and everything else. So what is your vice?
It's pretty tame. Riding bicycles is studying the Federal Reserve.
Riding bicycles, studying the Federal Reserve, and watching some baseball.
Yes, I love baseball.
Have you ever been to Pittsburgh, PNC Park?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you have to come.
So I look forward to it.
Well, come
I'm
on.
sure the prices there are more affordable than Yankee Stadium these days.
Yes, it's a little cheaper. We'll see if we can get you into the ballpark. I'll buy you a hot dog and a beer.
That's the fun part of a ball game.
Absolutely.
Sunshine, baseball, hot dog, beer. Life is good.
Life is good. Mr. Forbes, thank you very much for your time. I truly appreciate it.
Kevin, thank you. Appreciate yours.